On today's World Insight, global alarm over heat waves and other extreme weather, prompting urgent action on climate change. For its part, China doubles down on green targets, but could geopolitical tensions get in the way?
Decarbonization or the net zero transitions to the Chinese economy or to the European economies is never to be one route.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. This has been a scorching hot summer for northern countries, including China. Since July, many parts of China have suffered high temperatures, with temperatures in some places breaking records. According to the World Weather Attribution Group study, the current level of global warming has made heat waves 30 times more likely. That makes climate action far more urgent. But in the meantime, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan has led to the suspension of China-U.S. official talks on climate change. So how should we understand the latest situation? What does it mean for China's progress toward its green development goals? Let's ask our panelists. In London, Damaris Kaufman, professor in economics and finance of the built environment at Bartlett, also the University College of London. Meanwhile, we're also joined from Tsinghua University, distinguished professor of climate change economics with the Department of Earth Systems Science, Professor Guan Dabo. Last but not least, in Beijing, Zhang Jianyu, Executive Director of BRI Green Development Institute. Welcome to all of you. Mr. Zhang, first, how much do you see the significance of the latest move by China to pause the official discussions with the United States on climate change?
Well, I think first, the visit of Speaker Nancy Pelosi certainly undermines the core interest of China. That's why you're seeing China is taking up all kinds of countermeasures to show its stance. And I think this latest move of China to put a hold on, 8 bilateral collaborations with the United States, and one of them is on climate. I think climate has really risen up as something as important as all of those important conventional topics. And also, I think that China thinks that the U.S. really wants to work with China on the issue of climate change. But I want to emphasize, I don't think this is the end of it. I think the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi, said very clearly that China is ready and open for the resumption of those dialogues that are essentially important to the supply of global goods.
On the other hand, how important is this bilateral official exchanges on climate change between China and the United States for the overall international discussions and interactions leading up to the climate change summit in Egypt later this year?
Well, certainly the bilateral climate relationship between China and the United States is very important. Remember, back to 2015, it was the U.S. and China's bilateral agreement that has cemented the foundation for the landmark Paris Agreement. And also, it was last year in Glasgow that the new agreement between China and the United States to advance climate actions in the 20th of the 21st century that has really shown a new hope for the world. So I think there's no doubt the bilateral relations between China and the U.S. Not on climate and everything is really important for the whole world.
On the other hand, Professor Guan, how much unofficial interactions between China and the United States on the climate change front?
There's several perspectives we can say from the unofficial collaboration between the U.S. and China in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation. And first, from the academic perspectives, there's a lot of the cooperations and also the virtual and the physical discussions. Don't forget, we have maybe thousands or maybe more of the scholars, Chinese scholars, and the U.S. scholars in each other countries for exchange, for capacity buildings, for other type of academic exchange. So I think that's just from the exchange perspective, from the academic perspective. Another perspective will be from the public, like a company level of the corporations. China and the U.S. are still the main suppliers for the global supply chains, together also for the low carbon technologies or any new energy areas. So the cooperation between U.S. and China is still going on and won't stop.
We see, Professor Guan, that both China and the United States have made the national commitments. Now, as we speak, China, of course, 2030, 2060 agenda, and also for the United States, and now the Senate has passed the bill which is related to the climate change, likely to be what the U.S. believes the largest provision of funding for the issue ever in the U.S. history. But of course, a lot of them go to the electric cars. Having said that, though, how do you see the two countries' individual commitments to the issue of decarbonization and also climate change?
I don't see either of the country will compromise their commitment to the climate change goals. What I'm a little bit worried is that with the long 30 years or 40 years from now on, how the U.S. Would, especially in the next couple of decades, would be able to consolidate the funding of financial mechanisms for developing countries. I think achieving net zero emission goals for U.S. is one goal, but others is helping the other developing countries, especially for the new emerging economy, Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, Ethiopia, those African, they are really growing a lot. And in the last year Glasgow and previously in Paris, there was a commitment from the developed countries that they will deliver $100 billion US dollars for helping developing countries to capacity buildings and financing the new technologies. And this is something hasn't been achieved very much.
Professor Hoffman, your thoughts on some of the previous questions?
Well, thank you. I largely agree with my colleagues who've made very excellent points about this. I think that one thing that is important to emphasize is that the United States and China are at different stages of development, and the U.S. was able to industrialize without any concern about the environmental impacts of that industrialization, whereas China has, since the financial crisis, made enormous strides in poverty alleviation and made enormous investments in infrastructure. But of course, we recognize that infrastructure and construction of built assets accounts for about 80% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So there's a very different context in which China has had to both engage in widespread poverty alleviation and investment in infrastructure, and at the same time ensure that emissions peak by 2030. So the climate justice argument, which Juan Dabo alluded to, is very important, and that is that how can these two examples of countries that have already industrialized and countries that are completing their industrialization serve as models to the rest of the world, so that we can ensure that they're able to complete their development, but at the same time mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions, and also ensure that their infrastructure is climate compatible and resistant to rising greenhouse gas, rising global temperatures, and within the context of needing to meet commitments to limit greenhouse gas emissions. So the idea that China and the United States serve as different kinds of examples of what needs to be achieved and can work together, I absolutely agree with Juan Dabo that the important thing is to try to understand how we can help the rest of the world with meeting their own targets, because we can't tell the rest of the world that, sorry, the US and China have completed their poverty alleviation and industrialization. Everybody else now isn't allowed to complete their own development trajectories. Because I think what people forget is that between the First and Second World War, the United States was a lesser developed country. The New Deal, the extent to which the federal government, helped to develop through rural electrification, through big transport projects, through big infrastructure spend, the United States, in a process that wasn't completed until after the Second World War. China's just been through that same 2-decade process, and the rest of the world has every right to follow suit. And ensuring that there is climate justice, I think, is the biggest area in which the U.S. and China should cooperate.
Very interesting. You are suggesting it's extremely significant and important that we look at not just now, but rather the stretch of history and what it should mean with the context of history. Having said that, though, how much is there interactions and synergies between China and Europe on the climate change issue?
There's a lot of active research and a lot of participation of EU and UK universities with Chinese universities on climate change mitigation, on adaptation, and as Dabo said, on low carbon technologies. I think that the official links are growing quite a lot, partly because there is a bigger appetite in Europe for climate change mitigation from the bottom up. So things like China's success with ultra low emission standards for factories, which have the co-mitigation potential of reducing air pollution and reducing carbon emissions. That's something the Europeans are very interested in, where the Europeans and Chinese share experience more easily because the political appetites are more similar in terms of reducing carbon emissions from the bottom up. The individual household and firm decisions are perhaps more aligned.
How do you see that, Mr. Zhang? China-Europe cooperation, both official and unofficial?
Well, there's actually really a lot of going on, and I would say it has been going on at multiple levels. There's a direct bilateral dialogue between China and EU, and primarily several conversations have happened between the Executive Vice Premier Han Zheng and Vice Chairman of the EU Council, Mr. Timmermans. And also there's cooperation at the bilateral level. For example, there's far reach cooperation between China and Germany on energy efficiency, industrialization efficiency, and also at the academic level, as my colleague just said. And one thing I really want to salute the EU colleagues is their help and support of the launch and build of the largest carbon market that China launched a year ago, and we just celebrate 1-year anniversary. I myself was personally involved in those bilateral cooperations. I can't remember how many times I have traveled to Europe, to Brussels to talk with the council members, to Berlin to visit the Carbon Trading Bureau. And I think that there's lots and deep-rooted collaboration on climate-related topics between China and EU.
There's very interesting coincidence that is going on right now. To a certain extent, it is challenging, but to a certain extent, it could also bring opportunities for cooperation. For example, the use of coal. Professor Guan, China has been a country rich with coal resources. On the other hand, the clean coal technology that is being developed over the years in China is certainly a shining spot. Meanwhile, some of the European countries, due to the latest geopolitics between Russia and Ukraine, had to go back to coal. For example, the country of Germany. How do you see a potential of China and European economies trying to figure out the best ways, the most efficient ways, even by using coal, and provide better solutions and more solutions to the issue of climate change and decarbonization, Professor?
Exactly like you said, the decarbonization or the net zero transitions to the Chinese economy or to the European economies is never to be one route. There has to be several or many pathways. And we are at the beginning of the transitions. We should explore and allow people to explore all the best possible all the possibilities, basically. Personally, I don't against using coal as long as using in a clean way, and also we have a CO2 emission removal technologies to be developed simultaneously with that. And then in Europe right now, I'm actually working with the Ministry of Science and Technology in China, and together with the German side of that, we can see this their attitude to change in terms of fossil fuel. As long as we have some removal and decarbonization technologies for those the removal emissions, then we wouldn't be a harm for the global climate change mitigation.
What you have just said reminds me of a very crucial issue, that is what is the role of government and how government works with different walks of life within the society on the issue of climate change. For example, there has been concerns of inconsistency in Washington about the policies toward climate change. Not to forget, earlier the Trump administration withdrew from the global climate talks. And yet, with the midterm elections coming up, even with this climate bill, what's likely to be the U.S. commitment 2 years from now during the presidential election and after is also an interesting question. Now, Professor Kaufman, how do you see the possibility of consistency from the largest economy in the world, namely the United States, and how the others, including the number 2, like China, number 3, Japan, and of course the European Union, looking at the consistency issue?
Well, I mean, I obviously have an American accent. I haven't lived in the States for almost 20 years. I've made my home in the UK, so I'm perhaps not an expert on American politics. But what I would say is that I think that what is happening is that people are beginning to get a broad consensus around accepting the reality of climate change. And it's not even entirely clear to me on the Republican side that Republicans don't believe in climate change. They just don't believe that any policies are going to stop it, which is why, under the Trump administration, you had NASA publishing 4.5 to 5C climate change, trajectories as if they were established fact and saying, oh no, there's nothing we can do about it. I think the problem in the United States is that indeed there are a number of different groups, and there is this 4-year election cycle, and the U.S. can change its mind very quickly. And I think that example of the legislation around protecting the ozone layer is a good example of where the U.S. can very quickly shift and get a consensus around the need to do something. And there will be a lot of back and forth and to and fro, but eventually the United States will commit. And I think it was Churchill who said that the U.S. will do the right thing only after exhausting all other opportunities. I think that the U.S. will indeed eventually do the right thing on this. What is rapidly disappearing in the United States is anyone who actually believes that climate change isn't real. I think there are not very many of those people left. It's just that there are some people who think that there isn't much that can be done about it.
Mr. Zhang, your thoughts also on the same question. How optimistic and confident China is about the U.S. consistency on the climate change issue? Of course, Churchill's quote is certainly of a great reference about the country, and yet urgency is also an issue here.
Yeah, I think there's 2 levels. One is on the issue of consistency itself, and second is on the China confidence in this. I want to also quote the 2019 the Nobel laureate of economics, one said that it's hard to envision an effective climate policy without a carbon pricing component in it. And I think, U.S., if you look at it, has always been sort of lame duck. Sometimes the lame duck president, sometimes the lame duck Congress, and sometimes in the most recent event is the lame duck Supreme Court. Remember, the Supreme Court just made a decision that EPA doesn't have the power to sort of mandate renewable energy for the coal-fired power plants to go low carbon. But with that being said, I think for the price on carbon is really where the consistency is. And in this incident, I think we should welcome the inclusion of a matching fee policy in the imminent the climate bill, the Inflation Reduction Bill, that I think is putting the U.S. consistency back on track. But on the China side, as I just said, China, I think, fully embraced not only the goals, but also the means for climate policy, has the largest carbon market right now. And I think China has grown strong and confident enough in its independent climate policy that we will proceed regardless of what U.S. is going to do. But certainly, I think we recognize the existential threat of climate change and welcome a collaboration with both U.S. and European Union.
Professor Guan, I think it might be unfair if I ask you this question, but I just cannot help. How do you see the climate change issues is being manipulated by geopolitics? But on the other hand, it also needs the support of geopolitics to make it an international commitment and realization.
Well, I think the climate change is a geopolitical issue because it's a global issue. It concerns every human beings on this earth, and it's about the human being as a species on this planet, how we are gonna sustainable living on this planet, basically. So then it concerns everyone. So it becomes everybody's responsibility, and then in the economic sense, it becomes nobody's responsibility. So how we could avoid such geopolitics is that it has to be from the bottom up. Will everybody on this earth will have already somehow, to some extent, to experience the strength of the climate disasters, climate risks happens, especially this year's extreme heat across more than half of the hemisphere. And then we've seen the flooding, we've seen the hurricanes in the U.S., we've seen the many other things, the wildfire in the western part of the U.S., right. And then the flooding in China and pretty much everywhere. The scientists keep telling the public is that this is largely caused by the climate change. And if this is a common consensus by everybody on this earth, and I don't think that will become a geopolitics anymore.
Professor Kaufman, that Professor Guan said climate change is a geopolitical issue. Agree?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do agree. I also would like to pick up on what he said, because I think it's absolutely true that we've spent a lot of time talking about state actors, about nation states. But the reality is, in particularly in the United States, which is a wonderfully large and very diverse country, that what you find is that sub-state actors, whether it's large cities or state governments, provinces, regions, can be incredibly important in affecting climate policy. And one of the things I am most proud of about the United States is the extent to which that federated structure actually works to produce all sorts of local outcomes that are better than the federal outcome. And I think that we will see increasingly a lot of activity by sub-state actors. Geopolitics is not just about nation states.
Mr. Zhang, finally, your thoughts also.
Oh, I think one really important element that when we talk about geopolitics is the developing countries, and I think is actually up not just China, also U.S., also European Union, to join hands together and remember their commitments, not only to just clean up themselves, but also help those countries who have not gone through or in the process of going through their own industrialization process to manage carbon. Because if we recognize climate change is an existential threat, the solution is on all of us, right? Not only one single country can do this. It's actually very unfortunate if you look at the most recent bill that there's really no mention inclusion of the international aid part, which compared, China has championed out this Green Belt and Road Initiative. China is committed to helping developing countries to build a low carbon green energy system. And I think those are the elements that unfortunately is missing from the current geopolitical discussion. So I think people should look more for how they can cooperate with each other, and rather than just a geopolitical rivalry that prevent them from working with each other.
张建瑜, Guan Dabo, last but not least, Damaris Kaufman. Thank you so much for joining us. All the best. That's our discussion on the latest China-U.S. interactions on climate change issue and also where China to go from here for the green development. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, you can find us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.